Hello, my friends. This is life coach Mike Trugman, and welcome to an episode of Mike's Search for Meaning. I'm after some big questions. Why are we here? What makes a fulfilling life? How can we grow individually and collectively? Each episode, I'll dive deep with leaders who are doing great work in the world and see how they organize their life. Books read, value systems, resources used, and stories that show how each of you can create the life and the world of your dreams. Robbie Swale, welcome to my version of just long form, rich, deep podcast fodder. Welcome to Mike's Search for Meaning.
Mike, it's great to be here. And as someone who loves long, rich podcast fodder, I'm delighted that that's what we're going to be doing today.
So you've listened to a couple of my episodes, and I think you know where I typically start with, but I was really appreciating the question. You asked me a beautiful question right before we jumped on here. And I think I've recorded 106 episodes at the time of our recording today. I've released 101 so far. And you asked me something along the lines of what made for the best conversations that you've had so far. And you've been a guest on, I think, probably about the same amount of shows that I've now hosted. You've done at least 100 because you did the 100 podcast challenge. So I actually am curious to know what made for the best conversations as the interviewee, as someone who is being hosted. What made for the best podcast conversations that you've been on now that you've done triple digit episodes?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I have been on a lot of podcasts, and we could talk about that because that was that's how we originally connected. No, it wasn't, was it? It was almost how we originally connected. It was part of that initial connection.
Yes.
And it was an amazing game for me to play, a way to challenge myself. I mean, it was really interesting because I kind of got you could suddenly really feel, especially because sometimes so my challenge for listeners was that as part of promoting my books, I would try and appear on 100 podcasts in 2022. And there are various ways that I set that up for success in different things. But it meant that, I got going slowly because that's how these things work. And so the pressure was up. And the second half, I did more in the second half of the year than the first half of the year. And I did more in the last 3 months than in any other 3-month section. So there were days when I would do a few. But even without that, doing that many in a relatively short space of time of a year, you get to really feel the difference. And for me, what I loved is something really similar to what you said about what's made the great episodes of this show great, which is attunement and presence between two people exploring things together. And you could really feel if you were on, if you're being interviewed, not that there's anything wrong with either of these, but my preference, you could really feel if you were being interviewed by somebody who had thought about the conversation a lot, but was then in the moment, versus somebody who had thought about the conversation a lot and created a map for that conversation and was following it. And, following it almost to the extent sometimes of, I've got 6 questions or 10 questions that I'm going to ask Robbie. We're going to ask them and then that's it. And it's like, there's no problem with that. It's just that as an experience, as a human, being able to be in presence with people, being attuned, discovering new things through the conversation, like that is as both you and I know from coaching, both as a kind of coaching client and doing that work with people, that in itself is quite a transformational thing. And so to get to do that, right, like 4 times in a week towards the end, is really different to get asked some questions by somebody. And you could feel, the other thing to say is, I got to really feel the quality of listening, which is not that, I don't usually feel that much anymore, because I'm not paying it, in normal life, I don't pay that much attention to it. And when I'm being coached, I'm being coached by people who are expert listeners, because that's one of the things I seek out. It was interesting to feel. I guess I'm noticing in this moment, I'm remembering where there were some where the questions were kind of mapped and followed, which felt like that. And there were some which still had some of that feeling of attunement because the host was an expert listener in some way. So that would be being listened to really beautifully. I got to kind of feel that difference again, which I haven't thought about in that way for quite a while.
it's the same on my end. You know, I think that we gave similar answers in different ways, but there's just something so beautiful about the conversations where, yes, the way you said it's perfect. Yes, there was preparation beforehand, and I did my work and I did my research, and I might have even mapped out what a great conversation would look like in my head. And there's this natural emergence in the moment and attunement to each other that you can't possibly plan for, right? In some ways, I think that's why I've fallen in love with coaching for many reasons, but one of the things that I've fallen in love with about coaching is that it's this intersection of so many different things that contribute to a moment being beautiful, but it has me in touch with what is beautiful about being alive. And one of the things that I experience as the most beautiful about being alive is when someone's just really there with you. And we can all feel that, but some of us are trained to pay attention for what that looks like. And yeah, this is helping me click some insights around how I want to continue to show up as a coach, as a podcast host, because yeah, when I hear someone talk about the kind of 6 to 10 planned questions, I turn away from it, and I almost have some level of contempt, or like, oh my God, who would do that? But in a way, I actually, I think there's a lot of, I don't know if it's conditioning or we're taught to plan for things. We're taught to plan every aspect of our life in a lot of ways. And so it actually makes sense. And to a certain extent, I do that before the conversation happens. Like I've listened to you on several podcasts, Robbie, and there are times where there's magic that happens in the episode, and I'm like, there's a part of me that wants to bottle that up and create, what's the question that they ask, and I make sure that I ask Robbie that same exact question. And it's this dance of so many different things. But anyway, I'm really appreciating that you asked me that question and beforehand about what makes for really great episodes, the most memorable ones for me. And that's something that I think in the intake form of my podcast, I ask you what would make this a home run. But I actually think a question that I would gravitate more towards is, if you have been a podcast guest before, what has made for the greatest conversations you've had, right? And I think that gives me a clue into how I can show up to provide the best possible experience for someone who's joining my show. So I'm appreciating that.
Yeah, and I should say for listeners, I think that I asked that question because as a host, I once got asked it, and this is how I tend to learn, right? It's like, oh, it was great that I got asked that question by a mutual friend of ours, Toku McCree, and he asked me it. And then we did create an amazing episode together. And then once you've done that, I do the same thing in my coaching. Once you try something once and it works really well, you wait for the moments to try it again. And I think it's a really interesting, we're talking about an art form here that is quite new, podcasting. And one of my thoughts about it, I think this is a sort of original thought. I'm always interested in those ones because so much of my work is often about taking ideas from other people and combining them or resharing them with my own flavor. But I had this idea that what podcasting lets us do is be part of more of the kinds of conversations that we wish we had in our lives. Mm-hmm. And that can be true whether it's like ridiculous conversations about football, on soccer in my case, but it could be any football, on the one hand, or deep, meaningful conversations of connection on the other hand, the kind that you're just talking about, that many people are starving for really in their lives. And if you get to tune in for a couple of hours to, like I have been delighted to do, to you talking to your dad or you talking to another mutual friend, Joel Monk, for 2 hours, like there's a feeling that comes from that. And to do that at the start of your day for 30 minutes, that's if your whole day is absent of that kind of attunement and connection and the beauty of those moments that can be, which for many of us our days can be, then what a gift that is. And so, yeah, it does feel like that's what's possible in podcasting. And then we have this interesting balance, don't we? I'm just kind of catching it. I'm remembering not the exact podcast that I was on, but I'm remembering one where somebody did have almost like a standard set of questions that they asked all their guests. And that could be, and in some cases was, a kind of like robotic interview, right? It's like, why do I need the interviewer here? You could just send me these and I can like answer them to my phone in a video, and then we've done it. And there were some a bit like that, one or two maybe, but there were also people who, took that as the starting point, the structure, the equivalent of you doing some research or me doing some research for one of my interviews on my show, takes that structure, and the structure then creates the space for the other stuff to happen. And, I don't mind having people having questions that they always come back to on shows. As a listener, it's quite fun, like, because you kind of know what's coming. And it's always funny when guests do or don't know that those questions are coming, all that kind of thing. But for me, aliveness is important, right? In this thing that we've been talking about, it sounds like it is for you, about what makes these things meaningful. So there has to be some level of aliveness, I think.
Not to linger on this too long, but we've got plenty of time ahead of us. So I'm curious to hear, because I don't think I've actually thought too much about the format of my show and of your show, the doing 90 minutes to 120 minutes as the container, if you will, that allows for these alive conversations to emerge. And I've done episodes that are closer to an hour. I've gone a little over 2 hours, but I think maybe another ingredient of my favorite shows is that they're typically in the, even a little more than 90, they're typically in the hour 40 to 2 hour range. And I wonder, what do you think it is about that time frame that is such a good container? Because I know, like, really, there are great podcasters like Tim Ferriss and Andrew Huberman who they sometimes go 3.5+ hours. And I find, like, whoa, that's actually a little more than what I'm looking for here. And the ones that are 45 minutes or even 50 to an hour, like, I find myself wanting a little bit more sometimes. So what do you think it is about that container, the container that you and I both are creating with our shows?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that come to mind. So one is, I think that it allows, so for me, the difference between an hour and 40 and 40 as a podcast length is that an hour and 40 just allows for exploration, like real exploration. It allows for a 20-minute tangent, which is a part of aliveness, and 40 minutes doesn't. And that's fine, but it is what it is, right? Like, don't expect really alive conversations if both you, the host, and me, the guest, know that if we're going to talk about, I'm not sure, we don't know what we're going to talk about today, and that's, like, in some ways, and that's beautiful. But on the podcast challenge, everyone knows that we're going to talk about my books, right? We're going to have to say something about who I am, because otherwise, why are people listening? Honestly, by the time you've done that, that's 40 minutes. So there's really no time to do any kind of tangent there, really. If you do an hour, you've got time for 2 more questions, really, if they're alive questions. In an hour and 40, you've got time to do all that, which does matter, and often matters to the guests. And then you've got time for a lot more exploration. And I've heard Tim Ferriss say that the reason that what he thinks happens is, you need the first hour to get through the stuff that everyone always says about themselves and their work. And only when they've done that can they relax and say the new things. And that's not always true, but, I know that the people at Ferriss interviews, they've often done, and I've had this a little bit when you interview somebody who's been interviewed 100 times or 1,000 times about the same kind of things. There is more of their stuff that they kind of always say.
Yes.
And then you need to have space to get to the next thing. Now, having said that about Tim Ferriss, I think that's changed over the course of 15 years or however long he's been doing it. The interesting thing is, I think, if I think back to, I haven't listened to many, but I've listened to a couple of Tim Ferriss episodes that are really long. I think there's something about when you get to 3 hours that actually it's really hard to hold the whole thing in your being. So you're doing more letting go of content, which is like, okay, and you're doing less, okay, I really have this sense of what that conversation between Mike and Robbie was like and what it was about. Whereas if you got a 3.5 hour one, if I'm listening, as I often do, in like 30-minute segments, like 3.5 hours is twice as many 30-minute segments, which probably means, like, instead of listening over 2 days or 3 days, I'm listening over 4 days or 6 days. And that, again, I just think that's quite a lot to
Mhm.
a lot to hold. But I don't have anything against that. I do sometimes listen to those things. I don't know if you've ever listened to, there's a podcast called, is it called Hardcore History? Which is like this guy called Dan Carlin. And they're like, each episode is always 3 or 4 hours. And I haven't listened to that much of it because it's so long, but it doesn't stop me listening, right? It's just a different kind of art, really. But yeah, I love this. I love this length of conversation. I also think personally, so the reason I make episodes like that is because I like listening to them. But also I have like a part of my psychological makeup is that I hang on to endings too long. So like I'm always the person who is like the last, after I don't do nights out anymore because I've got 2 young children. But at the end of a night out, I'd always be the person on the corner at the end, having the last conversation with the last person when everyone else has gone home. You could map this all across my life. So I get really anxious, actually, like a bit and dissatisfied with when I've had to do a tighter episode because I just know there's more to do, and it doesn't let my bit that likes to hang on to endings. I always say to guests, actually, it'll sometime between 90 minutes and 2 hours, there'll be a natural point that feels like the ending. It's always at 1 hour 59 that I go, time to end now, right? because there's so much more we could talk about, and I want to get that last bit of juice out of the time I have with somebody.
Yeah. Thanks for dissecting it like that. And when I'm in touch with you, you were sharing in the beginning about how we initially connected. I was gearing up to interview Joel Monk, who's the founder of Coaches Rising, and I interviewed him back in February. And when he's someone who hosts a great podcast and has been a guest on a bunch of different podcasts. And what did I filter for when I was researching Joel Monk and other podcasts? I wanted to listen to the longest one that he's been on. And if my memory serves me correctly, that was you. And I believe it was 2 hours and 6 minutes. And so there's just something, I was like, that's the one I want to listen to. I don't want to listen to the one that's an hour and 23 minutes or the one that's 50 minutes. So yeah, thanks for starting. Go.
I can really feel that though, Mike, like when you talk about it like that, and I know that feeling as well, because it's like, it's not true with everybody that I'm going to listen to a podcast interview with, but if I'm looking somebody up, it's like, if there's one like that, I know that I'm really going to know that person by the end of it. I'm going to have found a flavor of them, really, no matter the quality of the interviewing, because there's like time. Whereas in a 40-minute one, I don't know that I'm going to get a flavor of somebody. And if I'm looking to listen to somebody, I probably know a bit about their work already. So like sometimes I do, if there's like a book for somebody that I haven't read and I don't want to read it, if you can find a 40-minute interview with them, they'll pick out the most important bits, and that's useful. But if I want to get an actual flavor of somebody, then you can listen. If you can find a 90-minute, 2-hour one, you kind of know that you're gonna get the flavor of somebody from that.
So I'm finding myself curious right now. There's a couple of thoughts that are coming up for me. And when I started my show, to a certain extent, I still have a very tiny audience, right? Like I didn't start my show with a big following. I don't currently have a big following. One of the pieces of advice I got from people, not just from, random person who's never created anything in their life before, but even people who have created really great things that have a voice that I would want to listen to. 9 out of 10 people told me, start with a 30-minute or if you do a 2-hour interview, release it in 4 different 30-minute conversations or something like that. And I don't know, there was just something in me that said, I don't want to do that. I mean, there's a way that can be stubbornness, right? That I'm just ignoring really good advice, and maybe more people would listen if I broke it into 30, 30, 30, 30. But we've been talking about creation and creativity, and this is something I know that you think a lot about in your life. And so I don't know if the threads connect necessarily, but I think that there was something in me that said, even if there's no audience, that this is what creation feels like for me, right? Like I'm going to create this long form interview. And there's something about the way that Dan Carlin does his, that I'm sure a lot of people told him 4 hours talking about these random time period, the 1400s, whatever was happening in the 1400s. I'm revealing how little I know about history, but
the only one I've listened to is about like the the king of kings, Darius, the like Persian king who tried to invade Greece. Like the incredible detail about this and background. Yeah, like they definitely did. I've heard him say that they definitely, people definitely said this won't work for sure to him. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So there's something in here about what do you think makes for really great creation and creativity, and something also about this balance of like when do you listen to what feels true to you versus trying to meet the marketplace where it is, or your audience where it is. So this is something that I find myself challenged with this a lot as a creator and as an entrepreneur. Like, do I find a niche for myself to make it really obvious what I do? You know, there's a lot of noise around this. So I trust your voice about this, and I'm sure you've reflected on it a million times, and I'll let you take it from here.
I have, Mike, and I'll just say some things that kind of try and pull together some of those threads. So, look, for me, like the first thing that comes up, and I've had people say, like when I first launched my podcast, for people who don't know, is called, one of my podcasts is called The Coach's Journey. That's the one we've been talking about with the long form interviews. Mm-hmm. And when I first launched the Coach's Journey podcast, a bunch of people messaged me saying, can you just make some shorter episodes? And I just found this like truly gobsmacking, because it's an incredibly limited, like scarcity mindset, right? Just pause the thing when you want to pause it and come back and listen later. Like, what is going through that person's mind that they think that they can't do that they have to listen to it all in one go? I mean, like I got compassion for those people, but like it's really strange to me. Especially somebody who's been listening to, at this point, 2-hour interviews for 10 years probably, and like I know how to pause by this point, right? You don't even have to have it used to be a real hassle, right? You used to have to download an MP3 onto your phone or MP3 player, and then the apps didn't work very well. But now Spotify will remember forever where I am in the middle of my, listening to an episode of Mike's Search for Meaning. So I just think that's interesting, right? The other interesting thing about, similarly, limited thinking to me, when someone says, looking at the podcast market, says, Mike, you should do short episodes. Because Joe Rogan gets as I understand it, this is an out-of-date stat now, it's probably way more, gets like 300 million downloads a month. And these conversations are never less than 2 hours. Never. Well, maybe occasionally, almost never, right? Tim Ferriss, like you said, some of them are 3.5 hours long. And he's always in the top 10 podcasts of the type that he's in. Like, why does that make sense? Like, so that's the first thing, just to really catch that. I think that those, I know lots of people say them, but I just think they're quite strange, right? Both of those attitudes. I'm really glad you made what you made, because if we zoom out a bit and think, and I look at this less from someone who's just interested in how podcasting works, and more from somebody who, like you say, has thought a lot about creativity. So my series of books, for people who don't know, it's called The 12-Minute Method. It's about how to beat procrastination and be more productive. And above all, it's about how to finally do things that you have wanted to do for a long time and not done. Right? How to actually do these things. And that's because that was my quest, my journey, my personal, when I say my quest, my personal quest. Like, how do I do this thing? How do I go from somebody who's stuck, who isn't doing these things, to doing it? And I've investigated that in a bunch of ways for myself, for clients, that kind of thing. And look, that one of the key ideas is, right, if you're going to make something that matters, you have to make it, right? And if you're wrapped up in, should I do it like this? Should I do it like that? Then that makes it much less likely that you make it, right? Really, when we're going to make something, especially something that endures over time, my view would be that we need to make it into something that we would make regardless of whether anyone is listening, right? In the case of podcast, reading, in the case of a blog. So make that thing, right? And that also works, right? Because we no longer actually really need to work to corner a market. Like, you don't need to be the number one podcast in whatever category of podcasts we would put this one in. You just need to find your audience. And that can be a global audience. And the best way to find a global audience is to make something that really reflects the creator, and then let the people come to you. And that might take a while, right? And again, it might take a while, and this is why it's important to make the thing that you want to make that actually calls you, that actually brings you alive. Because if it might take a while to find, people say it in different ways, don't they? But I can't remember who it is. Somebody coined the phrase 1,000 true fans, right? It might take you a while to find that 1,000 people. So in the meantime, be making a thing that actually brings you alive, not a thing that someone's kind of told you should make because tactically it's better. Like personally, as a kind of a thinker and a strategist, somebody who can do those things really well, if I spend too long thinking, what should I be? What's the smartest thing to be making here? Then I will never make anything. If I listen to like, what do I actually want to make here? Or what am I being called to make? Then that's really different. And so you asked, part of your question was something about what makes for great creativity. And I always want to stop people at that point. Like, what makes for great creativity is actually creating something. Like, that's the most important thing. Worry about great creativity later and create something. And the chances are, if you kind of follow intuition as you do that you end up making something way better than you thought you would.
Yeah. The beautiful reflections. There is something about, so we touch a little bit, or you touched a little bit on this, what I imagine is this completionist thing where I don't know, I think because maybe it's because of the way that we're educated, it feels good. There's something about our psyche that it feels better to complete the 30-minute conversation than to leave that loop open and just pause it at the same exact spot, right? And I actually used to do this with books a lot. Like, even if I would borderline suffer through the book just to say I got it done. And one of the ways to safeguard against that is to just have a shorter book, right? So then if we do this with podcasts, like if I have a shorter podcast, even if it sucks, there's something about the way that we're conditioned that says we need to finish this thing, we need to just keep going and not pause it in the middle or pick back up later. And there's also something really obvious about the capability that we have to say, I'm going to choose to pause it right here. This is a good stopping point anyway. And I'll get back to it later when I have another 30 minutes, when I'm commuting again or whatever the thing is.
Yeah. And I think
so that's one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Like, I think there is we might have a slight lag, Mike. Sorry, I just realized. I know we're coming out of it a little bit. I wonder if that's happening. But let me just catch it. One of the things that I think is quite interesting is I originally was going to have my books come out as one book, one really long book. And then somebody gave me, so I want to slow down on this because it reflects on what you were just saying. Then somebody gave me essentially the same tactical advice. Well, not the same tactical advice, but they gave me the tactical advice. This would work better as a series. And I really rebelled against that until I slowed down and said, because the reason they were saying it works better as a series is, this is the reason, I'm going to spoil everyone's favorite authors for them. This is the reason all your favorite authors write series of books, right? Because if somebody buys one and likes it, they're likely to buy the others. So if you're writing Jack Reacher, right, by the time you've sold them one Jack Reacher book, you've sold them 5 more. And maybe you've sold them all 25 or however many there are more. I don't know. I've actually never read one. But, so they told me this because it was a tactically good thing to do. But I was unwilling to make the decision based on that. What I had to sit down with was, will it serve the people who read these books? Will it potentially serve one person better to have it like this? Because you can make all the things I said about the 30-minute thing, you can make that argument the other way, right? You can make the argument that, look, what's your problem, Robbie? Just put them out as 4 episodes. If somebody wants to listen to all 4, they can listen to all 4 back to back. Spotify will let them do that too. Like, what's the problem? And with my books, it became quite apparent, because each book deals with essentially a different stage of the creative process, that it could be really advantageous to sell them separately for people, because they might it might be that they want help with starting, which is that first phase, but it might also be that they want help with not giving up, which is the second phase in the second book. And if that's all they want, then just let them come there. So it's obviously not as simple as one way is right and one way is wrong. And it is a tension, kind of just heard me kind of describe it, that you mentioned, between what do I want to create and where are the people that I want to support and what might they need. And I think to be asking those questions, both of them, as long as you're asking both, then like what does my intuition tell me about what I should be making here? And then not abandoning, are there some smart things I can do so that more people get helped by this thing or inspired by this thing that I'm making? It's like it's not, I don't think it's not a black and white, is it?
No. And what I'm hearing, what you're pointing to, which I've heard you speak about in other appearances, is humility, right? There's a humility in creation that you don't get to decide necessarily all the factors that are going to stand out about the work that you do, right? Like just showing up and doing the thing and doing something that makes you come alive. Also being attuned to like, how is my audience responding to this? There is that tension of, am I creating something that is true to me as a creator that also is meeting, right? Like if I'm too in my ego and just being committed to being right, I might miss the chance to serve people that would really be served if I made this simple little change in my format, right? If I just broke it into 4 books, and I'm sure your audience has been served by your willingness to do that. So yeah, thanks for starting this episode with, in a way, a kind of a 30-minute tangent, right? And I think we're going against what Tim Ferriss's insight was, that you spend the first hour really getting to know who the person is, and then going into the depths there. I would love to focus a little bit now on who you are after we've gotten a flavor for the way that you think, and I love the way that you think. But let's see, there's dots that have been connected so far that I think are interesting threads to explore. And yeah, there was a moment earlier on that you were speaking about a stuckness that you had in your life. And I know that you've written a lot of books, or not a lot, the books that you have written have been in some way written for yourself, or written through how do I get through this challenge that I am being presented with in my own life? And can I write the book that serves other people? So something I know about you is that you were homeschooled until you were 9. Going to school and being put into a traditional education system presented challenges to you. And through theater and acting, you started to find yourself in a lot of ways that in terms of being homeschooled can be lonely and isolating, but I think you probably felt more autonomy and freedom in your life and less confinement. And when you got thrown into a traditional education system, that was probably the first time that you felt like, oh, what's my place in this world, or something like that. And I'm wondering, if from my own lens here, one of the ways that I've been stuck in my life a lot is that I've had to unlearn this kind of prescriptive path. Like someone dictates the way that my life goes. I do what needs to be done. And if I do that, then I will graduate to the next level. And then I'll do that to the next level. And that was true in school for me. That was true in college. That was true in my early career, really until I found coaching, that I started to really challenge the paradigms that I had been given. And so there's this question around, I kind of rambled my way into this question of, based on everything I've outlaid here, what influences the way that you think and that you look at coaching as almost an art form in supporting people to both understand where you came from and what influences the way that you think, and also as a way to support people in their becoming? Because I know that when you drifted and felt a little bit stuck in your life, you eventually found your way into coaching, and that became really this big turning point in your professional life. And basically it's like taking the red pill in a way, right? That you never looked back. It's almost become your entire way of being. So I know I threw a lot at you, but you're a capable man, and you'll I don't even know where the answer will go, but I'm really I've got my popcorn ready.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of beautiful stuff in there, Mike, and yeah, that is lots of reflections in there that resonate with me and where I feel like I came from and where I am. So, and it's interesting because I think that sometimes, I think that sometimes in my life, including in some of the conversations you've heard, I put a lot on that transition into school. And interestingly, I'm still doing my own work and discovering things about myself. And I think that some of that, actually, some of the things that happened with that were that they tapped into tapped into earlier parts of my programming and ways of being from earlier in life. That that happened to just really confront, or perhaps in any difficult time, we end up with running into the same challenges that we often have. But for sure, like influencing the ways that I think, right? It does feel like there are these two very clear parts of me that story that you told maps really nicely. So there's this intuitive, exploratory, home-educated little boy, right? So this is like 0 to 9. And not just home-educated anywhere or with anyone, right? But with my particular parents at that particular time in the world with they were born in the early 50s, so they kind of grew up in the 70s or became adults in the 70s, and that in the UK and I imagine in the US was a real time, right? A real cultural shift time. Mm-hmm. And they were in that. So they are incredibly exploratory people. And they have viewpoints which now are much more common, but at the time were are still quite unusual in lots of parts of British society, but at the time even more so. To let my intuition and interest guide us most of the time with that education. We didn't just do the school curriculum lesson for lesson, but at my house, right? We followed that, and they were able to hold presence and inquiry, I'm sure, around little Robbie. And then there's a different system, right? If you're going to educate a lot of children, and the education system comes from where our education system came from and originates in the era that it originates, and if you went to it in the mid-90s like I did, then that's a different environment with a lot of with adults who were different and children who were different to the adults and children that I'd been around. And so in a way, a second part of me emerges at that point, a part of me, an observer part of me. And maybe that part of me has always been there, but maybe my role is to be the witness, right? That's one of the inquiries that I've got at the moment. And that is certainly a mechanism which served me well in an environment that I understood not at all and found quite frightening and felt very alone in. And what my response was, as I think about it and understand it now, is like, okay, well, let's sit back, let's work out how this system works, and then I can operate within it. And that included academic learning. I'm sure it included in some ways social interactions, although that took me quite a long time, really, in some respects. And in some respects, I did really well with it. And then those parts of me are still there, right? But the latter one is the one, speaking to some of the things you said, that is the one that then gets reinforced and rewarded in an education system like in the UK, right? Can I work out the rules to passing my GCSEs, which is the exams we take when we're 16 in the UK? They might have changed their name again by now, actually. I can't remember. But that was what it was called when I did it. Can I work out? That was how I did it, right? Like, let's work out the rules for GCSEs, and then let's win this game of exam taking. Right? That's not the same. That's not how the 0 to 9-year-old me would have approached learning, but it's what was rewarded. So I got good at doing that. I got so good at it that the subjects I studied, and again, this is something that we have a little bit in common, were subjects that really reward that. Like, which I studied, like my favorite subject in the kind of 16 to 18 education was maths. And so that's what I studied at undergrad level. So I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics, right? And what that is in some ways is, what are the various rules and methods that I know to approach this problem, and how can I systematically use them until the problem is solved? And that is a way of being, right? It's in some ways it's the way of being, what do you call it? The Enlightenment, the post-Enlightenment way of being, right? This amazing thing, the scientific method that has transformed life on our planet. And math is a really pure version of that. Like, let's approach it. Let's use rationality. Let's use logic. And then there's a part of me that wasn't getting used by that. And so to try and pull that together to kind of capture that final part of what you said, which is what brings me to coaching, and how does that fulfill this? Like, I can really hear that. I've never said it in this way before, but I can really hear that in the way I've just told that story, right? That I was looking for in different ways to fit things to myself, and succeeding and failing at different times in different measures in the first 10 years or so of my career. And what I found in coaching is something that essentially allows me to use both those parts. So it is useful to have a set of methodologies and containers to support people. Just like if you're interviewing somebody, it's useful to have a set of questions or ideas about what you might talk about. But then we need the intuitive part of us to be able to follow things in the moment. And it feels like my work I've been coaching for about 8 years. It feels like a lot of my work. I didn't know this at the start. I thought it would be more, I knew that thinking was the thing I'd been practicing. I wouldn't have called it that, but I knew that I was a thinking person. And I thought it would be about unlocking feeling and emotion. That was going to be the route to coaching mastery, to really helping people transform. What it actually turned out, partly because of some training I did with Joel's company actually, is that for me, the first 8 years have been about intuition instead. So in some ways, it's been about recovering not the feelings that might have been sucked out of my life as a coping mechanism, but the intuition that I had grown to not trust in some ways or forgotten that existed. So that is what those things come together really beautifully in coaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you tell? This might seem like it's out of left field, but it was in the conversation that you had with Joel, and it's a beautiful demonstration of what intuition and being attuned to the moment looks like. There was a time that you were working with a client, and I don't remember the content or frankly the context of the session that you were in, but their dog was barking in the background. and that became something that influenced the way that you were conducting the session and where you took the session and what questions you asked. And so could you tell that story of the dog barking during a client session?
Yeah. So it reminds me of one of my favorite poems by a woman called Ingrid Goff Madoff. And I don't know anything about her except this one poem. And the poem is, I always misquote it. I'm going to try and get it exactly as she wrote it. God spoke to me in flowers, and I, who was waiting on words, nearly missed the conversation. We can, in our lives, when I say we, most of the time, like I mean me, but I know by this time that I mean at least me, and I'm 99% sure somebody else. We can live in a very focused way, and we can stay focused in on the thing that's there at the expense of the signs that may be around us. And one of the things that I learned through a program that Joel and his company still run, it has different names, in fact, and I know this because I have one of Joel's business partners is my brother. So that's partly how Joel and I know each other. I can't remember if we've talked about that, but so I know a little bit from the inside about this. The program that I did, that Joel used to run, I did the first year of it, was called Coaching from Source. As far as I know, the conversation, the same course is now called The Power of Presence. And that's about them trying to meet the market. But for me, it massively, I haven't said this to them actually, I haven't thought about it until now. It massively devalues what is actually in there. I mean, really, they're calling it that because they were calling it Coaching from Source because how do you try and talk about God or anything like that when most people live in a really rational world, and religion is hugely out of fashion in some ways for very sensible reasons. So they went for Coaching from Source, and then they've gone the other way. And I wonder if really they should have gone back the different way, which is to it's like how to have magic happen in your coaching, like coaching using magic, because that's what it felt like to me. What I was learning from people on that program, like Katie Hendricks and Jim Detmer and other people, and part of it was work with everything that happens. Like everything that happens in these conversations could be the perfect thing to be happening in this conversation. That random thought that you have, this isn't what they were saying, and I wouldn't have used the G word as often then, and I'm still not sure what I mean by it, right? But what if this random thought that I've had in front of this client is a message from God for this client? Like that's essentially the question that I felt like that training program was asking me. Well, certainly it's the question that I heard. And that's really interesting, because usually what happens when people come to something like coaching is they have to learn the rules so that they're doing coaching, not doing what they're used to doing, which is essentially teaching. We're used to helping people by teaching them and telling them what we think. And coaching is a different thing. It's about, creating insight through presence and curiosity, and great listening and all those kinds of things. So usually we're like, no, don't mention the random thoughts that you have in your head when you're learning to be a coach. And this training was the other way. It was like, let's assume you've learned not to mention the random things that come from you. But what about the random things that might not be coming from you, that might be coming from the client somehow, or from some other part of the system that we're in? And so I was sat with a client once, and I can't remember what she was talking about or why, but I'd got practiced at it, at like, whatever happens in the conversation, what if, and it's not always, but what if it is like meant to happen in this moment? Or what if humans, because we're meaning-making creatures, can make meaning of anything that happens? And we need to at least offer people the chance for that, for the thing that's happening to be a sign, whether it's the internet going down, or, I don't know what else it would be, like someone's chair breaking, or their dog barking like insistently in a very intrusive way in the call. And so I asked this client, if that's your dog trying to tell you something, what's it trying to tell you? And I can't remember what she said. I've got absolutely no idea, to be honest. But I just remember this feeling of like depth and profundity, because it was like the dog said, it was amazing, because she could, even if we think about this on a rational level, she was able to do this amazing thing, which is like project onto her dog both her, remember her dog's love for her, project an ability to actually speak, and kind of in dog almost, not like give it back in a kind of with the spirit of a loving dog, what she needed to hear in the moment in the conversation that we were having. And it was meaningful. And it was insight. And it just came from, it's a fundamentally ridiculous question to ask, right? Like, if your dog was trying to tell you something now, what would it be trying to say? But if we can hold that with respect for it, as though it could be a message from God, then then sometimes, not always, sometimes the message is really powerful.
I love that story so much, and it does in some ways, like a lot of dots continue to connect in this conversation. There's a lot of times we get into coaching because we've been moved by different maps and models that have really influenced us, and then we want to teach other people about those maps and models, and frameworks are really, really helpful. And there's a next, I don't know if it's a next level because it's not a hierarchy, but there's, if you want to be one of the most masterful coaches in the game, there's something about knowing that there are maps and models that are helpful, and that the client's mind might work that way, and it's helpful for them to have frameworks and structures. And there's other information that's bigger than me and you that is available in the conversation at any given point. And that's a big edge for me. It's a tough skill. We're not really schooled in that. We're not schooled on how to listen to the softer, quieter things that are happening in any given moment. And with stillness practices, in a lot of ways, that's what we're after, is to be in touch with more information than is just made up in the rational mind. And there was a part of me that was like looking for the profound, what's in this moment right now that I can ask Robbie. And the next question that I do in this interview, there's a little bit of a lag in his video, and is there a question I can ask about the lag in his video? And it's flurrying outside, there's a way that the mind, or my mind, will like try and hunt for the next thing. But I imagine in that moment, you actually weren't looking for the, like, what else is happening besides me and this client there. It was being thrown in your face a little bit, right? The dog was just barking and you eventually decided to listen.
Yeah. One of my coaches, Miles Downey, he says in one of his books, coaching is there's something someone once said about acting. There are no rules, but you have to know them. And coaching is a bit like that, is what Miles says in his book. And there's a good example of that, like, because there are no rules, right? You can ask a question about the dog, but you got to know the rules. And one of the rules of coaching, one of the things, is to be as present with the person as you possibly can. So I love what you just said there, and I've done that as well. It's like, as soon as I'm going, what's the cool question I could ask, or what's happening in the world for me or the client that I could ask them about to bring this to life, we're not present, right? But if presence is broken by the dog barking, like that's one of the, like, that's like a, it's like, that could be the time to break the rules. Breaking the rules, another great thing that the somewhat controversial Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson says about rules. He says, the best time to break a rule is when breaking the rule is more in the spirit of the rule than following the rule. So breaking the rule is more in the spirit of the rule than following the rule. So to do that means you have to really understand the rule. But if you understand the reason for not throwing every thought you have in your mind into the conversation and staying present, then you're in a place where when the right thought comes in, you can go like, oh, hang on a sec. This is something more than just a random thought I have. It might be in more service of this client, in this case, this amazing woman in front of me, to ask the question about the dog than it is to kind of do the textbook thing. And again, we can think about, in a way, the conversation we had about podcasting. The textbook thing will soon be a thing, if it isn't already, that an AI algorithm can do, right? Because it can read the textbook and then do exactly what the textbook would say to do. And that's not necessarily, sometimes that's enough. And sometimes there's more magic available to us, I guess, is what I believe from having been doing this for this kind of thing for 8 years or so.
It's such a good point. Such a good point. There's a textbook or an AI, a robot could, if you do the mechanical way of things, could replicate a lot of what's possible in a coaching session, but
actually, another friend of mine, Claire Pedrick, has written a couple of great books about coaching. She says that sometimes she does assessments for the International Coach Federation's credentialing. And she'll sometimes read a transcript of that conversation and find that it hasn't passed. I can't remember if this was at the top level. And we could talk about credentialing. And as someone who came from outside of the education system into it, I think most credentials and exams are a bit pointless, but the learning behind them can be really useful. And sometimes it's useful to have the qualifications if the world you're in requires the qualifications. Anyway, that's aside, really. What Claire says is interesting is you sometimes read a transcript that has and it's a textbook transcript. And yet it's failed the exam. It hasn't passed a human listening to it and knowing, do they meet these criteria? Even though it looks like it should have met the criteria, it hasn't. And then when you listen to it, you know why. And it's exactly this thing we're talking about. It's that the artfulness, as Claire and her co-author Lucia Baldelli would put it in one of their books, the artfulness is not present. The artful coaching is not happening. It doesn't mean it's not good or useful, but something that's possible is not happening in that conversation.
Well, to reflect back on the quote that you have about rules, which I love, there are no rules, but you have to know them. You could look at this as a life philosophy too. And on your website, it says something along the lines of most people follow the rules, some people break the rules, but for the most part, what is the last? I'm forgetting the punchline. It's like,
the truth is, most rules don't even exist. Yeah,
most rules don't even exist. Yeah. So I'm curious. I mean, you're a very thoughtful person, and being in the coaching game for 8 years, you're in a lot of ways you're playing by your own rules. And I would love to parse through the rules that you play by right now in your life, or maybe conditions that you create in your life, and how you set those conditions, which also in a lot of ways I'm sure informs the way that you serve your clients and that you look at what's most important in your life.
Yeah. So I mean, there's so many ways we could go from that, Mike, and so maybe let's you guide us in it if you have intuitions. But I think that the kind of important idea at the top of that, which I don't think I necessarily had when that page was created, but is feels very pertinent is it is one of the big I think it's one of the big shifts that people go through in their lives as they try to make sense of the world. And I'm one of my inspirations is a woman called Jennifer Garvey-Berger, and she is a part of the Coaches Rising faculty for one of their programs that they've run many times, called the Art of Developmental Coaching. And she worked very closely with Robert Keegan, who founded one of the developmental models for adult psychological development. And this is like a lot of jargon that people can just skip through if they're not interested, but people might like this grounding. And so this is the idea that you can group the way people take perspective on the world, the way they see the world, into some stages. And that as we grow and develop, if the world challenges us, we develop new ways of seeing it. And Jennifer's work is amazing because it takes a very complex field and makes it simple. That's one of her, or simpler, manageable for me, particularly in her most recent two books, Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps and Unleashing Your Complexity Genius. They don't have any of the theory, and they just have the practice of like, how do you deal with the complexity of the world? But one of the key shifts that we go through as an adult often is between what Keegan and Garvey-Berger called the socialized mind, which is essentially, and I had Garvey-Berger on my podcast and was able to say to her, this is how I think it is, Jennifer. This is how I'm teaching adult development to people. Is it right? And she said, yes. So that was a great relief for me, which is essentially the socialized mind is I take the rules that I am picking up from society of how to be a good person, and I follow those rules. And the problem we have is that used to work in a simpler time. Probably 100 years ago it worked, maybe 50, 60 years ago it worked. The last 20 years it doesn't work. And that's because you end up with a bunch of ways that you're trying to be a good person. I'm trying to be a good dad. I'm trying to be a good coach. I'm trying to be a good husband. I'm trying to be a good son. Trying to be a good brother, trying to be a good friend. I'm trying to be a good citizen. I'm trying to be a good adventurer in the world. That's just 8, and we could probably do 8 more if we really slowed down with it. And the problem with that is they contradict each other. Those eight good things contradict each other. I mean, the really striking one that Jennifer and I talk about in the interview on the Coach's Journey is we talk about women and how do I be a good mother and a good woman in the 21st century who has a career? And even if you just have those two, let alone, and Jennifer says, she also has, because she's a researcher, she also has, how do I be a good researcher? You don't need many, but like, how do you square that circle? I know that you're in this as well, because you've got a little boy. I'm in this. We've just had our second daughter. I'm watching my wife trying to square that circle, and it's almost impossible. I mean, it is impossible, right? At the point where it is impossible, that's when we're asked for something new. And this is when the most rules don't even exist comes in. So we have, most people follow the rules. That's when you're just trying to be a good person in all those different ways. Some people break the rules. We rebel. We just go the other way. We say, and that's not, and that's a good thing to do. Like having rule breakers. That's the 70s, right? That's what my mum and dad were doing by homeschooling. It's like, no, the schooling system is broken, and Robbie doesn't want to go to school, and we can do something different about that. And that's amazing. And somewhere really close to that and closely related is the rules don't actually exist. Right? So we're not breaking the rules for the sake of them. There are no rules. There's just all this like agreed sense of reality about how things work, and that everyone goes to school. And we don't live in that reality as much as we used to. But in North Yorkshire, rural North Yorkshire, where I grew up, no one else broke the rules in the way that my family did. Like, my mum and dad weren't married at that point. I had different surnames. I had a different surname to them, until my mum changed her name. We talked about this. Like, I grew up in an environment where it was very clear to me that the rules that most people think exist don't exist, but you don't have to follow them in that way. But what we might get to, if we're confronted by reality, and this is not a fun process, right? It's not a fun process to realize that you can't be a good person in the way you've been trying to do it, and that you're going to have to create a new way to see the world. This is like dark days, right? Happen when you're confronted with this, when your kind of worldview breaks, and often it's like there's something that happens. It's just like this. I can't believe in it anymore because this thing is proved. Go back to maths. It's like proof by, I can't what you call it, exception, right? Oh, it just doesn't work anymore, right? I can't see it like that, but that's like a scary moment. But the stage that comes next is what Keegan or Garvey Berger would call the self-authored mind. And that is where, instead of I'm going to try and be a good person in all these ways society tells me, we get to I'm going to choose how I am going, what a good person is for me. And we could talk about the stage beyond that, because that's interesting too. But for me, that's been, that in some ways, the thing that broke for me was how I was trying to do my career at the same time as a relationship that I was in broke down. It's like, oh, this stuff, like, obviously I'm not seeing everything, because if I am, this wouldn't have all happened. And so in a way, the last, it's more like 10 or 11 years now for me, has been the attempt to play with creating life, self-authoring life. And then it has mixtures of other things in there. And we could talk about what that looks like and what it means, but I'm going to pause because this is quite a long answer to a question.
No, I wanted you to keep going. So I would love to know, like, now that you've given a really great map that has been approved by Jennifer Garvey Berger herself. I don't know if that's exactly how you articulated it in the episode, right. But it's actually, I didn't feel like it was overly verbose. I felt like it was a pretty succinct summation of the socialized mind. There's a prescribed way to follow the rules, and probably learned it from society, parents, institutions, right? Like there's all these different things about what it means to be a good person, and here's the way to do it, and go out there and do it. And in the transition, most adults many might ignore this, but most adults at some point feel called to, including myself, wait a second, whose life am I living here, right? Like, what am I doing with my life? I don't feel like I've really chosen this path that I'm on. And that, yes, scary, but also eventually, hopefully, really empowering time or shift in our lives into self-authored, which maybe I will add here, they are not hierarchical linear steps, right? Like there's certain factors that we're kind of always on this scale of, I might want to say something, and there are certain societal conditions that might happen where I under no circumstances will say that. And it's helpful to have the socialized mind there where, I will adhere to, I'm not going to run outside naked right now because I know the consequences of that. Even if there's a part of me that thinks that would be really fun, or that I'll get a full body sunlight exposure to that, and that's healthy for me. There's I know that there's harm that can be done from me doing that. And so I guess I just wanted to throw that in there. They're not linear stages, but a lot of us as adults, we get to a point where we don't feel like we have any self-authorship or agency, or that we haven't chosen our life at all. And it's a very, very important skill to acquire if you are to live a life that you not even are in love with, that has any sort of alignment, right? There's going to be a lot of dissonance if you're not doing that. And so as you've started to be more intentional about creating the life and the set of rules that you live by, and maybe it's not rules necessarily, but just certain things that you're looking to, or maybe questions you orient yourself towards, just like what are the ways that you have set up your life for the most success for you? Like you were mentioning, I forget if it was before we recorded or started recording or after, but you take Mondays to be with your family, right? Like that's for a lot of people, it's a radical move to just say, oh, I'm going to build a business where I take off this Monday, or take off the full month of the year. So I guess, like, what are some things that you've created in your life that under the socialized paradigm would never be possible, but that you have been intentional about creating?
Yeah, so it's a great catch about when you label that stuff about the socialized and self-authored minds. Look, like any model, that's an approximation. It's not a diagnostic tool, and one is not necessarily better than the other. And if we hadn't had the socialized mind, none of human society exists. That would be that's kind of what Jennifer said when I spoke to her. It makes total sense, right? We wouldn't be able to cooperate if we were, pissing people off so much by doing weird stuff all the time. So that's all really important. Yeah. So look, one of the things I heard in that question, Mike, is so there are really practical things. Like one is, and they are they aren't all from me sitting, or maybe none of them are from me sitting and actively self-authoring. I mean, some of them are, but some of this stuff just comes in. I think, and there are practical things like only working 4 days a week. And it's like, I don't know if they were inspired by me. They might have been. I'd like to think they were. Like, one of the companies I have done a lot of work with is a creativity company in the UK and called 64 Million Artists. And Joe Hunter, their CEO, has been getting a lot of press lately because they shut down the company in August and they work a 4-day week, but pay people the salaries for a 5-day job. And they think, and this is what I discovered, like, I looked at that idea of working 4 days, and I said, well, it's certainly not obvious to me that I shouldn't be able to create just as much value and just as much money for myself working 4 days as 5 days. It's not obvious that more is always better. Like, that's a story that socialized mind in the UK, at least, and I think the US would teach people.
For sure.
And it's just not, the complexity of the world, if you slow down with it enough, shows that it's false. It's not always true. It's not always false, but it's too simple for the complexity of the world. So there are all these ways this shows up. It can be in practical ways, like, I'm going to work 4 days and I'm going to do that based on this assumption that most people don't have, that I can create just as much value and money for myself in 4 days as I can in 5, maybe even more. And certainly my most successful years in my business have come since I've gone to 4 days. Now, also, I've been in business longer, so I can't point to causality there. And then there are also these kind of like kind of self-authored belief systems, which are things like, if we think about the 12-minute method, the things I was speaking about before, it's better to make the thing than be locked in reasons to make it, speech marks better that end up with me not making it. Better to just leap. And I borrowed a load of that from the work of Stephen Pressfield, huge inspiration for me. You can just, that's what those kind of books, the kind of speech marks self-help books can do, right? They can give you a new set of assumptions and rules through which you can see the world, which make the whole world look different. But I want to catch, so that gives some sense of it. But one of the things that came to mind is, one of the ways that I now do this is to think about the arc of life. So to think about, and this goes to the 4-day thing and the time. So so I've been doing that. I think it was before we switched on. So let me say it again. I've been doing that since Leah was born, my first daughter. I finished my paternity leave. I had to shut the business down basically for a month to have a month off. And I was like, well, maybe now's the time. Like, it's never been my end game to work 5 days. I've shut the business down. Maybe now's the time. I've got a really good reason to take an extra day off. Now's the time to do it. But part of that comes from thinking about my own mortality. So inspired by lots of people, including Fred Kaufman and David Treleaven, people can look them up. But many more people than that. We have this truth that, and in fact, it's so funny, unconnected to me, Jennifer, in that interview that I was just talking about, talked about this as well. That the only certainty we have in a complex world is that one day we'll die. That's what we've got. We know nothing else about what will happen. And knowing that doesn't mean that it doesn't really change the unpredictability of the world, but it is a more accurate worldview than one where we pretend that is never going to happen, which is kind of what the socialized mind teaches us to do. Society in the UK, we never talk about death. We have all these other ways of saying dead, like passed away, passed on, just passed, but there are, no longer with us. There's all these ways, like, yeah, we're going to die. And then what we can do, though, is think about that. In Kaufman has a great book called The Meaning Revolution, The Power of Transcendent Leadership. He has a chapter in it called Die Before You Die, which is so die before you die so that you can truly live, I think is a Zen saying. But I'm very happy in that book because he quotes Braveheart, the movie. And in that book, Mel Gibson's character, he says, every man dies, but not every man lives. And this is the thing we have. And so this is the what we have available to us, right? Do we we're all going to die, but are we going to live while we're here? And are we going to think about that? And what, again, one of the things that I think the kind of countercultural way I was brought up, a mindset that my parents brought in, is you don't have to do the stuff that society says. And if we can slow down and think about what we really want, and know that we're going to die one day, and it might be soon. One of the exercises Kaufman does apparently with people in his workshops is he says to them, if you only had 3 minutes left to live, who would you call and what would you say? And he says that what happens in the next break in his workshop is like incredible to watch, because everybody makes the call, right? Because everybody knows from that, when we have 3 minutes left to live, we won't know. Like we might not know, but almost no one knows they've got 3 minutes left. And so we might not have a phone to hand, or the person we might want to call might not pick up. So with that frame, suddenly you're inviting people into like real aliveness. Like I love the fantasy author David Gemmell, and he writes about this too. And I can't remember the exact quote, but one of his characters at some point says, I think it's in his first book actually, it's the character Druss says to these soldiers that are going to face down an impossible, unbeatable army in a fortress that's undermanned. It's a bit like the Alamo or something like that. He says, you think life is sweet now, but when death is heartbeats away, there'll be nothing sweeter. And that experiment from Kaufman conjures that up, right? Like I wrote an article about this once, and I always try, and if I'm going to ask people to do an exercise, I always try and do the exercise myself first if I'm going to do a workshop. Like otherwise, there's integrity gap, really. And I realized everything else in this article about this idea of dying before you die, I'd done. But that one I hadn't done. So I sat down and I thought, and then I called Emma, who's my wife. And, Mike, it's a surreal moment that, I can remember it almost as though it was, the moments before I died. It's so clear because she was at work. She picked up, which is a little unusual, and she was on her way to her yoga class in her lunch break. So work ran some yoga classes, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her why I was calling. I'm feeling it now, because I didn't want to, in the same way you can imagine, you get it in films where, the guy's flying the nuclear warhead into the sun or something to save the world. And it happens in real life. This is amazing. They've actually got this audio of one of the biggest, I can't remember the name, one of the biggest disasters on Everest where the most people died at once. They actually, the guy, the leader of that, who in some ways, causes the disaster. There's a great bit about this in a book called Rebel Ideas by Matt Syed. But, they can patch him through to his wife in New Zealand who's pregnant. And you can listen to this call and you could, it felt like that, right? In that call, he doesn't tell her that he's about to die. Right, which I don't know if that was the right thing to do. This guy calling his wife from Everest, because he can't bring himself to do it because of what she's doing. But I know a bit what that's like, because I couldn't bring myself to even say to Emma, "I'm doing this experiment. I'm doing this exercise where I thought about what if I only had 3 minutes left, because that's gonna she's going to her yoga. I don't want to put that on her. She can just have her So I have this conversation where I just say, I just wanted to call to say I love you, and I've got it with tears silently pouring down my cheeks. But what a moment of aliveness that is gifted to us. And I don't know if I've ever said this to her. She's probably read it because it's in one of my books. But I don't know that we've ever talked about it. But I would have thought she will have picked up the aliveness, the desperation to really explain what's meaningful to her. That she will have picked that up even without that. So we have ways like that to experiment, to really remember what actually matters to us. We can play that kind of game. We can write the eulogy that we'd like to be given at our funeral and who would like to give it to us. Or one of the most enlivening ones is one I learned from David Treleaven and then made my own. So it's a bit like the thing we were talking about before. You take a thing, like the question about the podcast, and then you make it your own and you use it. And in an interview with Joel, again, to have lots of things sparking off each other, on the Coaches Rising podcast, David Treleaven talked about creating a commitment for his clients by asking the question, what would make you sad at the end of your life? And what I often do with my clients now, and sometimes with myself, is I ask that question, but I don't just ask it once. It's and what else? And what else? And what else? And what else? And then you create this, you have this list. I'd be sad if, and I'd be sad if this had happened and hadn't happened. And then what you do, and this is the Treleaven move that I stole from him straight on that podcast, is you then turn it into a commitment in the language, and this is important, I am a commitment to, and then it's the reverse of that. So, for example, and this, if you've ever done this, Mike, before, if you do it again now, you haven't done it since Nathan was born, then like it changes. Like mine changed a lot after Leah was born, right? But you can imagine like one of mine would be, I'd be sad at the end of my life if I hadn't been there for Leah in the important moments of her life. And that then becomes, I am a commitment to being there for Leah in the important moments of her life. And the language, people can try this, you can try this at home. Like, if you try, people always want to rearrange that language to something that is a bit more grammatically normal, like I am committed to, or I have a commitment to. But that language, if you try it, is really important. Because I am a commitment to brings all of that thing that could be a long way away, right into the present, into the body, into the self, in this moment. And if I am a commitment to being there with Leah in the important moments in her life, then what does that mean for me today? And what does that mean for me this week? And what does it mean for me this year? And it means that I'm there on her birthday, right? And it means that, I guess it's not quite the same commitment. There would be another one, which is like, I'd be really sad at the end of my life if my daughters felt like they hadn't had enough time with me, or I felt like I hadn't had enough time with them. And from that, we get a really easy, that's actually a thing I can solve for now. So that frame, what might I regret? Or what might me in 10 years, here's another one that I have that comes out of the 12-minute method stuff. It's like, and then I'll pause for breath. The frame that comes out of the 12-minute method, which is subtly different, but if people aren't so up for facing mortality, you can just play with this one. What will me of 5 years' time or me of 10 years' time really be glad that I've been doing a bit of regularly for the last 5 or 10 years? And when I look back, like me of 5 years' time is going to be so glad that I had these days with Leah, no matter how hard they were when she was like 9 months old and you kind of desperately trying to get the right number of naps in the day and get her to eat something and get her home for the breastfeeding at the right time or whatever the thing is, or just like stay sane as an adult with this strange little creature. I will never in my life regret those days with her, right? And that frame, will I regret this thing? Or will I not? That's an incredible frame for creating your own life.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What a beautiful and moving share on so many levels, man. So thank you. Thank you for bringing that to me. And yeah, this question of like, if you had 3 minutes left to live, who would you call? It was bringing up this example in my own life. It wasn't quite framed the same way. I was in a course, and the coach that was facilitating this course asked as a prompt question right in the beginning of the course, which kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. When was a moment in your life where you felt truly loved and seen? And this doesn't have to confront mortality in any way, but it kind of, in a way, to me, it backs into the same thing. It's almost a way of what is most important to you. Like when did you feel most connected and loved in your life? And I remember, much like you, this was during COVID, work from home. Boundaries are all super blurry. And I don't remember exactly what my wife was doing at the time, but I just went out in tears. I just, like, I don't even remember what the moment was, but I was so moved by even taking the time to connect with that moment that I was in tears. And it also had me connecting with a time, this part I remember very vividly. There was a time I took my wife to her favorite concert, or her favorite band, Churches. And it was right after we got engaged. And not to make excuses, I was at a point in my life where I felt outside of my impending marriage and my relationship, I just professionally was really, really having a hard time. And it was after a tough day at work. But I just remember it was the entire time at that concert, my wife was so excited to be there, and I was suffering through it, really. Like it was very visible that did not want to be there, wasn't happy about being there. And it really took away from my wife's experience. And for some reason, when I connected with what mattered most to me and when I felt most loved, that it came pouring out of me just how much I regretted the way I showed up to that, and I made a commitment that if I'm taking you somewhere that is meant to bring great joy in your life, like I'm just so sorry that that's where I was that day, that moment, that point in my life. And these types of questions really help us to get right to the heart of what matters most to us, which is not at all what I thought was going to come up when I asked you about creating the rules that you live by in your life. But as soon as you started talking, I started to get in touch with not just we started with the practical, but I think practical rules are really, really helpful. Like I, for the most part, don't look at my phone for the first or last hour of the day, unless it's to do like a YouTube breathing guided exercise or something like that. Like I don't do text before and after. And like those practical things are really, really helpful. But there's also a deeper way in which the rules can be something as simple as I have a choice in how I'm going to respond to anything that happens in my life. Right.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And a lot of the coaching that has been most beneficial for me has not been the making really clear, bright lines rules that help me practically, but more, how do I show up to life no matter what is happening in my life? And those are really transformative rules to have in your life. Like, I choose to look for the lessons that life is presenting me, no matter what's happening in my life, or something like that. That's a rule. That's a great rule. So yeah, I really appreciate the depth and richness of your response there.
Yeah, and look, those practical rules, they're really useful. And you can use the same frame. Like at the end of your life, are you going to be glad that you spent like 30 minutes a day scrolling YouTube or Instagram? Or are you going to be glad that you had 30 minutes a day more with this little boy who's like exploded into your life? And we can play the whole thing that way, really. I think when you've got children, it's like extra jeopardy somehow, because mortality becomes more real. But it's present for everybody. And what I heard in that, thanks for sharing that story about the concert, I can really kind of like, feel my own versions of that, and what it because it had come just after. And I don't know if this is quite what you were saying, but one of the things, again, I think it's in The Meaning Revolution, the Fred Kaufman book. He talks about going into all of his coaching sessions, I think, really living that rule. Like, what if this is the last time I ever get to speak to this person? And I mean, we don't want to say this. I don't even want to say this, Mike. It feels so much. But like, imagine if that had been the last time you'd ever had with her, because sometime it will be. And if we're not careful, we let all these things run our life. All these and they're not that they're not real, right? Not that you weren't having a shit day and a professional impasse and all these things, but we do have some choice in this, and that people often think that kind of considering death is a morbid exercise, and separate to that is it can be a lot for people to do, like a lot, if they're not practiced at thinking about that. It can be a big thing. But for me, it's not a morbid exercise, right? The morbid thing is not paying any attention to that until someone's dead, right? Like whether it's you or your, or me or my dad or whoever it might be. And what considering it does usually is connects us to aliveness, connects us to what really matters, and enables us to go like, yeah, look, like I don't remember that Friday. I remember it was a Friday when I called Emma and she was on her way to yoga. Like I don't remember, but we probably that morning been doing the things that we sometimes, for all I know, we've been doing the things that we do in mornings, which is like snap at each other a bit sometimes, and whatever it might have been, and you can let that stuff stay, or you can remember what actually matters, and what actually matters is we get to have this conversation. And you don't want that stuff. You don't want to spend too much time considering, like, in some ways, like some part of me still thinks I don't want to spend too much time considering this could be the last time, because you can get lost in that and lost in the panic as well.
Yes.
But I think that most of the time it takes us out of our ego. It takes me out of my ego. It takes me out of my fear. It takes me out of my taking my life too seriously. And it reminds me of what's important, to just go, okay, what if this is the last podcast interview I ever do? What if this is the last session I have with this client, what if this is the last time that I get to play with Leah? And, you know, God forbid that it is. And we all know somebody for whom something like that was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And yes, I think anything can be overdone. And so if your entire life is, like a desperate last second of plea for what am I going to do if I only have 3 minutes to live, then that can probably be its own challenge. But my experience is that most of us aren't considering it at all. And so asking the question, it might be the first time either ever or in a very long time that we have slowed down enough to consider what's the most important thing for us to do in this given moment. And so it's a beautiful invitation. And I'm finding myself drawn now, Robbie, to talk about honor, because one of the through lines of the prep questions that you answered, it was all about leadership with honor. And I've seen you do the episode that you did with Toku was sales with honor, and honor just feels like something that's really important in your life. So I'm just wondering if you are a commitment to honor, which I'm guessing in some way you've written that down somewhere and coded that into your cells. So what does being a commitment to honor look like for you?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It is and has been an exploration. I was doing some journaling the other day, and I found this phrase coming out of me. Success today for me is using honesty as a way to find the truth. And when I thought of that, I thought of this interview that was coming up later in the week, because we'd said that we might talk about that might be a frame. Leading with honor might be a frame. And for me, it's been knocking around in my thinking for several years, but it's still somehow embryonic. And this could be because I'm resisting diving into it in some way. One of the ways that emerged was I realized I had a workshop I was at, a kind of intuition-based, pretty transformational experience where I tapped into, I guess, a sense of purpose that I hadn't had before. And I always think the word values gets used a bit too much in kind of coaching places, and I'm never sure how useful it actually is, even though people think they want to do it. I could talk about I've come to a place where I really know why I think it's important. In a way, it is this thing we're talking about. It's how do you define the rules for your life, and how do you live honorably? Well, in some ways, that is you understand what really matters, and then you do those things, like you live in alignment. But one of the things that came up for me was I had this set of values that these set of words. I will live a life of courage, honor, vulnerability, and truth, and inspire others to do the same. That was what emerged from this workshop. And a couple of years after that, I noticed that I was talking about three of those words a lot: courage, honesty, and vulnerability. And I was never talking about honor. And I get really interested in that stuff. Like, if you believe like I do that, the next level of success is about being more of who you really are. It's like, there's this whole bit of me that I'm leaving out, right? Like, what is that? And that's when I started getting interested in leading with honor. And I think it's a concept that is quite absent in its just use of the word. You can tell that by the way that some socialized part of me was happy to talk about courage and vulnerability, and even vulnerability, which, thanks to Brene Brown, amazing woman that she is now cool to talk about vulnerability, and honesty. We kind of know that's important, but honor is not so much. And yet it was present in so many of the things. I mean, the things that we've been talking about, right? Including the author David Gemmell, including, much more. But so what is being a commitment to honor? For me, I think it's probably easiest to tell by virtue of a David Gemmell story. Let me see if this actually works. I don't think I've ever told this story except to one of my coaches before. But essentially, one of the characters, the one I mentioned before, Druss, he's someone has asked him, or he's found himself, one of his friend's sons, or a local prince, or someone has been abducted and kidnapped. And Druss and his friend, I think his friend has agreed to try and save the person. And Druss and his friend are going to try and do this. And as they do it, they hear someone screaming from a in the middle of the woods, and Druss walks into this clearing with, I can't remember what it is, 4 armed men tormenting an old man and a girl. And they go to the edge of the clearing, they see it, and Druss walks in, and his friend can't believe it, because the mission they were on is to save this person who's been kidnapped. And walking into a clearing with 4, it might have been 12 armed men is not a sensible thing to do if you want to do that. And yet it is so obvious to Druss in that moment that is the thing that he has to do, because it's the right thing to do. Because no matter what is happening, it is never the right thing to do, for him to walk by people in need when he might be able to do something to save them. And at the end of his life, he's never going to look back on that and think that was the right thing to do, and he's not going to be at peace with himself. So to make that more real, like, most of us don't walk past that kind of thing happening, although, like, it pays to think about that, because sometimes one of us might. And what is the right thing to do in that moment? I guess it probably would be to call the police before you walk in, right? Like, whatever the thing is. But I guess what I would say in this moment is, like, being a commitment to honor is living a life that I can be at peace with, where there's no sense that I've walked on by things I shouldn't have walked on by, where I haven't let my fears rule doing the right thing. I haven't let anything, I haven't let it being hard in all the ways that life is hard get in the way of doing what feels like the right thing.
And I'd say, I don't know how close you live to a city, but in some ways, we're all confronted. Like, I live near New York City. Anytime I pass someone who's without shelter, there's an opportunity for me to, I don't know, either say something, give them $1, right? That is the example. That's what I was in touch with when you were sharing about living and leading with honor, and about not passing by when there's something in you that knows this isn't the way. If I look back on my life, I'll regret that I didn't do something about this, or didn't in some ways take action. And I'm as guilty as anyone about just walking right by someone and making up that it's not my problem to solve, which on a grand scale, of course, is true. But in that moment, I have a choice about who do I want to be, how do I want to show up, what would be the most Michael thing to do in this moment. And walking by is not the answer. That is definitely not the answer. And it's something that I do, and it's something that I'm working on myself. And I imagine you can confirm or deny the validity of this one, but I imagine that honor is a tough one, because vulnerability is something that you can choose in any given moment about, like, I'm going to share something about myself that might have not been easy. But honor, it becomes something that's it much bigger than you, right? It's more of an interfacing of how do I show up for other people in my life that is aligned with me. And, I feel the same way in my life, right? Like, courage, vulnerability, those were really, really hard. To a certain extent, they still are. But I get to, in kind of safe, contained ways, I can show up to and embody those qualities, and person to person can model those things. But honor, wow, that's a much bigger word. So I'm appreciating that you're stepping into that challenge, right? Like, that is one that many of us don't confront. I imagine a lot of people don't even look back with regret on that, because we're too caught up in our own stuff to be thinking about how do I show up for the circumstances and others around me outside of my family and whatever. And yeah, I'm feeling challenged in a good way by your share around this.
Yeah, and people may not think of it in that way, but one of the as I've thought about that idea of leading with honor, one of the times that it really confronted me, it's a little bit like the dog barking or God speaking in flowers when I'm waiting for words, was I had a series of clients, like 3, and I'm going to say 2 weeks, who started work with me. And each of them in different industries, different companies, essentially was asking the same question. And they didn't ask it exactly this way, but they said it. The question was, I want to succeed in my work in some way without having to compromise who I am. And that is leading with honor, right? It's like, it doesn't feel true to me. Like I choose not to live in a world where you have to do the latter in order to do the former, where you have to compromise who you are in order to succeed, right? Again, this is how I choose to live. So we get another thing there. Like, I choose to do my business in what I believe is an honorable way. And I should say I learned that by the mistakes I've made. So I think guilt and regret, they are fantastic tools for understanding what really matters and for building an honorable, like what might to me be an honorable way of doing business. So the game in the coaching becomes, with those clients, how do I succeed without compromising who I am? And what does that mean? And that's not easy, but we get to it, right? It's like the success, like you said, it's a really great thing that I haven't seen before, that honor really does require an interface with something else, with the world. It's about how we show up in some way. And yeah, it's a exciting thought experiment to do, and people think it's impossible. And you're right to point to that conversation with Toku. That's a great example of a place where people think it's impossible to be honorable. Sales, lots of people have that. The same with marketing, the same with influence. And yet, if we just slow down, it's in fact, in sales, if you go all the way back to Dale Carnegie, you'll find that his book about sales, How to Win Friends and Influence People, is incredibly honorable. It's all about really honoring the person that you're selling to. And yet, for some reason, we have this stage that we have this idea that it can't be. And so, whilst people may not think about honor in that way, if we bring it back to that idea of, I guess it's another way to define honor would be, again, it's all these words. In some ways, leading with honor is my way of coming back to all these words that happen in the world of coaching and that don't quite end up sounding a bit cliched. It's how do I live in alignment with myself? How do I be true to myself whilst interfacing with the world? And not everyone will come into contact with that. And I've got this like little thing that I don't know if this is true, but given what we've been talking about, I wonder if it starts to happen much more as we get into operating more from self-authored perspectives. Once we've let go of socialized, only then do we really have the in alignment with me part of the map. And only then can we see that we're having to compromise myself in order to do it. And only then do we start asking that question. I don't know that bit. I've never thought that before. So that's a new thought.
I feel like there's so much more that we could explore around this. So I'm going to give you the opportunity, if there's more that you want to say about leadership with honor, or fill in the blank domain of your life with honor. And if not, I have a few. These are more of my, what listeners, if they've been tuned in for more than a couple episodes, would come to realize have been my go-to questions at the end of conversations. I would love to hear your answers to some of the go-tos that I have at the end, but want to give you the opportunity. We still have some time, at least on my end here, to further explore other aspects of the conversation, including where we already are, leadership and other aspects of your life with honor. Is there more that you feel called to share?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of things. So one is, or two are, that often for people, honor will include honesty and integrity. And so those are, for most people, a part of that. Like most people, when they slow down with it, will come to, I think, and from what I've seen, will come to those as being part of it. I'm compromising myself by not being fully truthful here. I'm compromising myself by, I said I'd do this thing and I haven't done it. And so I just want to say, if people want a way to experiment, those are great places to start. You can stop lying. Like, that's a great place to start. Like, stop it everywhere. There's no need. Like, it's perfectly, again, Jordan Peterson has one of his 12 rules for life is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. So at least don't lie. That'll change your life. You'll be so much more, you're so much more integrity. It's transformational practice. And partly because it does that thing that came up for me in my journaling. You then use that honesty to discover what you really believe and what the truth is. But also because it stops all these weird things polluting your life, like, always being speech marks sorry for the delay in replying to someone's email. I realized that was a lie. Like 98% of the time, I wasn't remotely sorry. I'm just lying. Every email, I'm lying. Like, what is that? And you have these things, they show up like that all the time. And we could just eliminate that and stop polluting your ecosystem with these little lies. Now it's quite hard because then you also have to get into things like when someone says, would you want to come out for a coffee? And you say, so sorry, I can't make it on Wednesday. When really what you mean is there's something else I'd rather do. That takes a bit more skill, but even that can be skillfully done. And with integrity, again, we can go back, we can fill the integrity gaps we've had in the past. That's a good exercise. What are all the things that every now and again I just remember that I once borrowed that book from that woman and I've never given it her back and I've lost it now? Well, at the very least I can message her and say, I was just thinking about borrowing that book and never giving it back. You've probably completely forgotten, but in case you haven't, I really don't mind buying you that book again. Like, what's your address? You can fill that. And then instead of having all these things in the back of my mind about integrity, I can have a clearer mind and kind of lived more honorably. We can always honor our word, even if we didn't keep it. And there's always the option to do that. And the last part is, this is a time when having a coach is really useful. Like, I'm really grateful for the coaches that have helped me do things honorably, honor myself in a situation, not compromise myself in a situation that it would have just been so hard for me to work through by myself. And it's one of my absolute joys with clients is to find someone's like, I can't possibly reach, the kind of sales thing, and I can't possibly reach out to leads, because it's like I'd have to compromise who I am to do that. And then it's just such a beautiful thing to find the way that person can honor themselves and do the thing like that. So just wanted to kind of point to those, because it can sound maybe a little like conceptual or old-fashioned, but if we make it real in those ways, I think that just kind of, for me, just wanted to do that to bring that and ground it and give people who are listening ways to play.
As you could tell by my response, the so sorry for the delay in my response to your email was a very funny one. And I've actually, if I go that route, I've more been, maybe every now and then I say sorry for the delay in my response, but I've been saying thank you for your patience in me taking my time to respond to you.
But you get that like, that's beautiful, Mike, because that's just a completely different thing, right? That's like, I'm grateful for you for this great thing that you've done, rather than I'm guilty for this fake rule that no one has set, but that we've somehow got into this habit of wasting millions of hours every year across the country with 7 billion people typing this sentence 5 times a day. Right? Actually, it came, just briefly on that actually didn't come from an experiment with telling the truth. It came from a Gay Hendricks experiment. I know you've had him on the show. He talks about putting yourself on a diet of not complaining about time for 2 weeks and see how that changes your reality. Right? Because how we speak, how we think affects our reality. In his case, he's playing with time and how time feels. But in the tell the truth experiment, we're playing with, look, just really ground yourself in what is true for you in that moment, and you have to consider what is true for you to do that. But either changes reality.
This isn't, this doesn't feel like a great place to end, because now there's this topic around time and Newtonian time and Einstein time with Gay Hendricks that we could have another at least half-hour conversation about that. But I do want to start to land the plane here, and I'm in no rush, but I have a few questions. One of them has arisen from this conversation that we've had today. This isn't one of my go-tos. I'm going to start with that one and then move into my go-tos. And so the question I'm sitting with right now, which I think will help me reflect on how I would answer this for Nathan. It's Gabriella and Leah, yeah? Your two children's
That's right,
names?
yeah. So
to play a little bit with this the time bound, not that I'm going to die, but if I were to reflect on, 5 years or 10 years future time from now, if Gabriella and Leah were listening to this conversation in 10 years time, or you can make it 20, whatever the time feels right for you, what would you want them to know?
I mean, the strange thing, like I think about this quite a bit. I've had a guest who was on my podcast die, and I'm really aware since I had the girls that all these conversations that I have are online, are live. That they one day might be listening when I'm not around anymore. Because we don't really know what these things we make now, these digital things, they can stay as long as anyone's paying the hosting fees. I mean, look, Mike, the answer came really straight away. All I ever want them to know is that I love them and that they are loved and lovable. And I really hope that they'll know that through being with me. But if you are listening, then I hope you still know that now.
That's beautiful. And Nathan, same for you. Whatever time you're listening to this, I actually had the chance to say this in another show, and I totally forgot that it happened. But the host asked me some version of what would I want Nathan to know, and I said I unconditionally love you. Yeah, unconditionally. I love you for exactly who you are, and I apologize for the times when I lose sight of that and project my own crap onto you. I'll throw that in there too.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Sorry for all the ways I fucked you up, girls, but also I love you.
So thanks for answering that one. My go-to questions are as follows: what's an ordinary everyday moment that brings you great joy?
Like reading, and reading before bed, which is almost always, which at its best is for me like a fantasy novel grounded deeply in old stories about humanity. So when people are really holding the old stories that humans have been telling for thousands of years in some way.
What is the kindest thing? This is kind of a different backdoor to what do you want to be acknowledged for? And I ask it sometimes. What's the kindest thing that someone could say to you about you?
I think speaking in some ways to what we've been talking about, but one of them for me is you were really there when I needed you. Again, that's for a long time. It's probably not in my list now, but that was a commitment. I mean, it is there. It's one of my commitments. I'm a commitment to being there for the people I care about when they need me. So to know that people thought that would be really kind.
And what would that mean about you if you were there when they really needed you?
You're a good friend. So you're a good brother. You're a good husband. Whatever it might be.
This is borrowed from our aforementioned friend Tim Ferriss. But when you think of the word success, who's the first person that comes to mind?
Well, I don't know why. I'm not going to overthink this. So Fred Kaufman, who I was talking about before, comes to mind. And this is, I'm not sure, I don't know much about him. I don't know that much about him. I don't know how happy he is. You never know this from the outside. I always thought on that show, on the Tim Ferriss show, when he asked that question, you would get there were two possible answers to it. Often people would say, well, it's not really about a person, it's about something else. Or sometimes they would name somebody quite famous and then they would kind of caveat that a bit. But look, what I admire about Fred Kaufman is he's one of the people that I can see really trying to bring honor, although he talks about it sometimes in different ways and sometimes in that way, into the world we live in. Trying to say all those things I said about it is possible to do these complex things that look like we have to do them a certain way. It's possible to do them and still, be at peace with yourself. It's possible to be skillful in business and be doing the right thing. It's possible to combine an interest and passion for kind of the speech mark traditional success with an interest and passion for some kind of less traditional kind of success that we're talking about. The success that's more about meaning and more about success beyond the normal definitions. And so for all of those reasons, there's a lot that I admire about him.
All right, Robbie. Well, that leads into the final. Well, before I do the final question, I'll give you the opportunity. If I miss anything, fill in the blanks here. But you're most active on LinkedIn, and people can connect with you at your website, Robbie Swale, which is your name here, ROBBIESWALE.com. And I'm sure all your books and everything is linked there. Are there any other places you'd want to point people to? Coach's Journey podcast, the 12-minute method podcast, right?
Yeah, that's right. So for people who are coaches or interested in coaching, there's loads and loads of resources at thecoachesjourney.com. Everything else, for everything, robbieswale.com is the place to go. Yeah, the books are in Amazon, all the places. The podcasts are on all the podcast places. I am on other social media, but LinkedIn is the one that mostly I'm on, partly because originally that's where my writing practice started. And so I'm still there many years later.
Mm-hmm. And the final question, and in this interview, it actually feels a little anticlimactic because it's the question that you know what it is. What does it mean to live a meaningful life? Like you've already given it so much more depth and richness than what might be possible in a kind of, you have to formulate it in a 3 minutes to 5 minutes or less version. But I still am curious, given that we've had such a meaningful conversation today, what in this moment feels to you like it would constitute living a meaningful life?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, given the conversation we've had? Both, one of the things I love about myself and one of the things that causes all my struggles is my tendency to question things. But what came up as you were saying that is, you can be pretty certain that you're living a meaningful life if you're asking the question, what would make this meaningful? What would be meaningful about this? What would be a meaningful way to spend my life? And that's pretty much all you can do. Like, that's the antithesis to, waking up to saying, I'll get things meaningful once I've made this much money, or I'll retire and that's when I'll find happiness, or pretending you'll never die and then dying and never having thought about it. The antithesis to all that is asking, like, what would be meaningful? What is meaningful to me? And those answers, my experience of asking questions like that is there are consistencies in asking that question, and there are things that change. And there are things that change it because I change and the world changes. And so the answers are different. And that's probably why it's a living question, not a single answer.
Well, Robbie, the conversation, we talked about aliveness from the onset, and a lot of what you're doing or pointing to with these types of questions is that they're alive, right? Like, what is a meaningful life is an alive question. Our relationships are alive. The world is alive. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing. And I'm very in touch with the beauty of being conscious and being alive by way of this conversation right now in this moment. So I want to acknowledge you and appreciate you that we at the kind of right in the, couldn't have possibly planned for this, but right in the middle of that sweet spot we were talking about, right? Like a little shy of 2 hours right now. We've explored the depths of a lot of different aspects of what it means to be alive in our world and what matters most to us, and confronting mortality. And, I experience you're sitting with this kind of question of what does it mean to be an honorable person, an honorable leader. And I experience you in that way. I experience you as someone who is living with honor, who is there for the people that matter most to him. I've never actually been there for it, but I just get the sense of when you say that, there's a valence to the way that you're saying it, that like, this matters to me at my core. And I really feel that. And I feel that in the conversations that you have on the Coach's Journey podcast, and in the however many times we've connected, maybe three or four times, that there's a level of care. And I look forward to almost every I mean, not almost. I think I've looked forward to every conversation I've had on this podcast, but I had the sense that we are, I don't know, we're connected on this level that's more than, we're like, we call it fellow kindred spirits, or people that are just consummate students of life. And I feel that we're walking similar paths in our life, and it's just been a real delight to host you on my long form version of podcasting, and on the Mike Search for Meaning show. So thanks for being here with me.
Yeah, well, I've noticed this a few times recently when we've been emailing about this, that every time you acknowledge me for something, I find myself thinking, I could have said that about Mike. So thank you, Mike, because those things, they were really kind of, they could have been another answer to that question. And luckily, for me, you're not the only person to say things like that. My coach said it as a challenge. He was like, that leading with honor will start with you leading with honor. But also people have, that is the feedback that I get. And it is a product of being interested in these things, I think, for a long time, but also of doing, the things we've been talking about in this conversation, really thinking about how do we create the rules that, that allow us to do things the way our soul in some way tells us we should do them. But Mike, it's been a total pleasure. Time's flown by, and I love the curiosity and the exploration that happens through this podcast. And I think you're making something special, and I'm glad you didn't do 30-minute episodes.
I'm glad I didn't either. Yeah, the longer conversations, they suit me. They fit me well. So thanks again, Robbie. I receive and appreciate the kind words. And yeah, there's one of my other teachers. His name is Raul Espinosa. He taught me this phrase that I've been saying over and over again since he taught me: spot it, got it. And in a lot of ways, the things that I am seeing and acknowledging in any guest, in you and in any person or any guest I have on the show, it's something that I love about myself too. And so I can acknowledge and hold that to be true as well. So thanks for reflecting that back. And to everyone who's listening, thanks for spending 2 hours with us, and in whatever increments you did it. Maybe you did 20, 30 minutes, or maybe, because this conversation was so fucking awesome, you didn't anticipate it, but you spent the full 2 hours with us. I really appreciate you being here. If you enjoy what I'm up to, then please leave a review, subscribe on YouTube, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. Show some support for the show. I really appreciate it, and sending you each lots of love. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to Mike's Search for Meaning. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, share this episode with your friends, and leave a review. I look forward to seeing you next time, my friends. And until then, stay safe, stay well, and keep living with purpose. Peace.